Thanks again, Ron. I really appreciate the introduction and for you inviting me to speak here. So, like Ron highlighted, I am very excited to have a discussion with everyone today. So, I'm going to try and blow through my actual pitch of my paper and my framework. So, I'll try and knock that out in 20 minutes or less, save the majority of this venue for just straight up discussion. On that note, my first few slides are just presenting one quick, clear argument. So, unless you got something burning, we'll just go through that and then I ask for keep your questions for the discussion when we go to the four policy scenarios. So, a quick background, everyone here, please just call me Jeff. I am a major in the U.S. Army, but you see my disclaimer at the bottom. Nothing I present here necessarily reflects the Army or the Department of Defense's opinions. I did do this research while at the Army's Command and General Staff College, but we're going through a bit of a policy change in the department right now. So this is just Jeff presenting something he researched, and I hope you guys like it. Quick shout out to Mr. Lackley and the Reviewer 2 Does Geoengineering podcast. If you want a rehash of this same discussion with me and Mr. Lackley, please check out that podcast. So today's agenda, I'll go through my quick argument on and setting up how I got my four policy scenarios. I'll give you guys some new information that I've decided to put on the slide for the first time, and then we'll just go into discussing all of the above. So, here we go. Okay, so I'll start with a quick background. The audience I'm speaking to is everyone here is climate aware. This is definitely a group dedicated to action, as you mentioned earlier, but I think it's still important to provide the background of why people are even discussing solar geoengineering in the first place, because it is a pretty unique new thing. Well, the example I use is I think of the atmosphere as a blanket. And through the Industrial Revolution, through emitting greenhouse gases, we have taken that natural atmospheric blanket and made it a lot thicker. And it's just a simple geophysical problem from there. You make the blanket thicker, eventually there will be some equilibrium at a much higher temperature until the Earth naturally radiates so much more. And you see that depicted on the left. The problem is where that geophysical equation levels out sometime in the future is much higher than we want it to be. Definitely much higher than the Earth has geologically adapted to in the current era. You can see that slide on the right from James Hansen and others depicting accelerated warming, and partly this is what drove the discussion of solar geoengineering just a few years ago. So why is this a problem? Why is this worth talking about? What are going to be the negative impacts of this new heat equilibrium whenever we reach it? Well, don't take my word for it. Take it from the national security strategies of both the United States and China. A quick note, when I reference the national security strategy, I mean the United States' one from 2022. There is currently a new one being released, but we don't have it unclassified yet. So every time I say that, it's the 2022 version. So the US already labels the collective impacts of climate change as, I quote, potentially existential for all nations. And I highlight that sentence because it is severe. That is, I have not encountered more severe language about any international security threat in any national security document ever. We don't talk that way about nuclear war. We don't talk that way about war with China or Russia. But when it comes to climate change, the Department of Defense and the US in general are on the record calling it potentially existential. And next, I'm going to highlight that the Chinese government has a similar document. They have their Climate Change Adaptation Strategy 2035. It is a national level document right up there with the 14th five-year plan. And it specifies that climate change is a serious threat to the present and future survival and development of mankind. Again, these two very large, powerful states, arguably the most powerful and influential states in the world right now, both agree that climate change is an existential threat. But here's where I want to add something new to the framework and the discussion going on around this. And that's by focusing on the geopolitical realism of it. So realism, it's a very self-indulgent term, but it is the academic term for a perspection of geopolitics where states are primary actors and they generally do what is in their own self-perceived best interests. So when we talk about climate change, when I saw a lot of the discussion of geoengineering, it presented climate change as kind of an exceptional issue for good reason. You just saw from two governments why, but as something that's going to function primarily under international liberalist institutional perspective of geopolitics. And I think there's a misconception with how climate change is going to impact the world. You can see one diagram on the left, and there's a very popular perception that climate change is just going to take, okay, there's a certain amount of heating going on. It's going to take this temperate zone along the equator and a little bit north of it, and it's just going to symmetrically move it a few latitudes north. No big deal. Florida's going to move to North Carolina. North Carolina's going to move to New York, and we'll all just adapt. What's the big problem? Well, obviously, this group knows that those geophysical impacts are immense. We are talking trillions of dollars in decades and definitely in centuries, but in a decade's timeline, trillions of dollars of impacts to the economy as we understand it today, to the infrastructure required to adapt, to the loss in natural services that the environment provides to economies. Truly something massive. But in the climate change community, there's still this perspective, a prevailing perspective of, we'll say, like a pan-humanist perspective of we are all going to suffer symmetrically, and therefore we are inclined to cooperate symmetrically to solve this problem. What I want to propose is the perspective on the right, which is that the foreseeable future of climate change, it will be a lot of destabilization and frequent extremes that benefit some places, but most importantly, they damage different places asymmetrically and at different times. To put it in other terms, there will be winners and losers. There is a version of climate change when it comes to states looking at their short-term material interests, where some will see that letting climate change play out is actually in their interest, and other ones, maybe countries that they don't like, are going to suffer a lot more than they are. Which brings me to the diagram at the bottom. So I'm focusing this research on the United States and China. That is already like there's a lot of baggage that comes into that perspective. It's the one that I just assumed while doing this research 2 years ago. And then Wake Smith and a few other authors recently published a paper arguing that the US and China are essential to geoengineering policymaking anyway, so it's worth focusing on them. Even in just the IPCC's description of climate risks, you can see that there's an asymmetry between the US and China. These two countries currently perceive themselves as locked in great power competition. The United States is explicit about it. We have a document called the Joint Strategy for Competing. It covers a lot of our international policy statements, both from the previous administration and the new one. We're in great power competition with China. And China shares that perspective. China thinks that it is a rightful world power. It thinks that the US is trying to contain China from its rightful place in world politics. And it even refers to the United States as the great enemy or the strong enemy in their documents about how they're ramping up their military and expanding their international policy. So that brings me to the option for dealing with this global warming and how the US or China might be interested in this option. I am focusing purely on aerosol injection. Now, there are parts of my research that are applicable to solar radiation modification writ large, but I am specifically focused on SAI. The reason is the White House itself, in a report 2 years ago or 3 years ago, specified that SAI is the most promising geoengineering technique available for near-term results. Based on the cross chatter I've seen in the HPAC distro, I think a lot of you agree with that perspective. Most importantly, it's the one that I'm focusing on because it's the one the White House was focused on, and it seems like some Chinese literature is too. So you're already familiar with it. SAI is effectively, if we go back to our blanket analogy, SAI is a form of adding a artificial sunlight umbrella to the atmosphere in some proportion to excess heating so that we can cool down the planet. Definitely pause global warming and, depending on your perspective, reducing it, going back to a more cool Earth. But this is the framework of making the decision to deploy SAI that is very prevalent in existing literature. And I've seen some of the discussion in HPAC emails. You're probably familiar with what is called a risk versus risk decision-making framework for SAI. I use this analogy of a big green button to help communicate with military people that I brief this with, but I think it's an appropriate analogy. When big we, are deciding whether or not to push the big green button of large-scale geoengineering, here are some of the considerations for it. You're like, hey, there are benefits. We're going to reduce global warming and climate change impacts. That's going to buy time for additional things like
Jeffrey,
carbon capture.
excuse me, Jeffrey, sorry to interrupt. We're getting people are not able to see your slides. Can everybody see the slides? Apparently not.
I can see them fine. I can see them. They're very,
I
very,
had,
very, very, very good. Very good.
I had
Crystal,
to
Crystal
click
here.
something in the upper left
Okay,
that
okay.
worked.
I guess it's maybe a local problem for Rebs and other people. So okay, sorry, Jeffrey. I just didn't. She's really wanted to see your slides. We will share them. Jeffrey has shared them to the list, and they will all be shared, after the talk for those who aren't able to pull them up. Sorry.
No, it's great. I sent it an email too. So if you check through if you just search your Gmail for my last name, it should pop right up and you can download a local copy too. So apologies to anyone who's not getting the feed. Um, all right, so you see the framework at the top. Like, what are the questions on this thing? You've got all the benefits, and we're talking tens of billions, hundreds of billions. Realistically, we're talking trillions of dollars of cost savings relative to other policies. Now, those cost savings, they're asymmetric in nature too, but we're talking about buying enough time for us to do all of these other projects within the SAI umbrella. On the opposite side of that risk versus risk decision making, you've got the moral hazard that, hey, if we're going to do this, then it kicks the decarbonization can down the road. There are termination shock risks if we do this thing. There's a lot of apocalyptic, just not a hyperbolic term, but apocalyptic projections of large scale geoengineering eventually collapsing, and we experience accelerated warming that the world is simply not ready for. And we take all of those existing climate risks, exacerbate them, compress them into a shorter timeline. And then there's the geopolitical one. Who governs this? How do we share costs? Who gets to determine program goals? Can this thing be weaponized? And what you see in geoengineering literature is a lot of this kind of debate on how we balance these two sides of this one big geoengineering equation. So that brings me to the next slide, which is offering a different perspective. And the perspective that I wanted to bring in is what the military calls threat-based decision making. This is a lot of military decision making. It's what I'm actually trained in. And it's taking what your adversary could or might do, how it might damage you, and then using that to frame your course of action. So I'm taking a lot of the same considerations, and instead of asking a global perspective on risk versus risk, I'm looking at the perspective of one state. We'll just say state A is the state trying to unilaterally deploy SAI, and then state B is the other one between the US and China. How might these two countries perceive SAI from the perspective of their adversary might do it, or is at least considering the same problem? So a few delimitations and assumptions of my research before we go on. I'll just talk the ones that I've highlighted in purple. The first assumption for me is that geoengineering policy will be driven by realist geopolitics, emphasizing the US and the PRC. There are clearly other important actors in that equation. We got that great link today to an article discussing India, advocating for them doing geoengineering sooner rather than later. Obviously, Europe is very interested in this. For the purposes of my framework, the US and PRC dipolar system or bipolar system includes latitude for their respective partners on one side of the issue, as long as it doesn't fundamentally alter the decision making. So just there is that asterisk there, but obviously I could expand the coalitions of partners in the future. And then also that geopolitics stuff. Maybe there is some kind of climate change event that makes climate change special and function outside of realist geopolitics. But I think someone would have to make the argument that that change has happened. So I'll continue with realism in the meantime. Next up is the scope. I know there's a lot of technical expertise in this group in particular, and I really appreciate that. For the purposes of my study, I am sticking to the scenarios that the scenario impacts and considerations much more than their probability. Because the probability of a certain scenario is driven by technical specifications, and the technical specifications are still broadly developing, so I don't cover a lot of the deep technical stuff. And then finally, on limitations, I am talking national policy. So I'm focusing on policy decisions, not those deployment specifications, which means there's a lot of room for me to get things wrong. It's a fool's man game to try and predict the future. So these are just 4 discrete scenarios within my framework. And if you have disagreements with these assumptions, that's fine. That's great. Just know I understand and pitch these scenarios as just my potential futures within this framework. Okay, so I'll move on to the first part of my actual framework, which is framing SAI impacts in terms of vital national interests. And that term is defined by the United States. It is defined by our joint doctrine. You can see the notes in the backup slides. but we define them in these three categories: protect the homeland and citizens, protect economic prosperity, and protect the national way of life. The first two are generally like a little objective in that they have really easy metrics assigned to them. The third one probably catches your attention because it's extremely subjective, extremely subjective. But for the United States and China, I'll argue that protecting national way of life includes their general geopolitical narrative of how the world works and those countries' roles in it. For the United States, it sounds something like we are the guarantor of an international system that more or less benefits everybody. And that geopolitical perspective has been consistent across US administrations, including the recent change that we've had. The current administration might argue that, hey, we've provided this thing and deserve a better deal in what we get back in return for it, but the overall narrative is still there. The US provides something to the international community and then deserves some kind of concessions or special consideration in return. The Chinese perspective, and this is explicit from President Xi Jinping and a lot of party statements, is that China is in the process of what it calls national rejuvenation. China is a rightful world power. It is a rightful co-equal world power to the United States. The Chinese system works. It elevates people out of poverty, and it's a model that some of the rest of the world should follow to create a more prosperous future for them. The mark on the wall for Chinese national rejuvenation is the CCP centennial anniversary of 2049. President Xi Jinping has been explicit. 2049 is when they're going to show that they've achieved national rejuvenation, although what that actually entails is still amorphous. So within those different perspectives, what are the risks or opportunities as that state is considering its adversary doing SAI? So first is potential termination shock, because while I understand it is still academically contentious whether or not termination shock is plausible, it is plausible enough that a state will be extremely interested in, does the US or China, does my adversary doing this thing risk some kind of catastrophic global event that I then have to deal with? And you can see a lot of the damages highlighted in there. The next two categories you can see are environmental damage. That's just the direct, whether you're doing geoengineering successfully, whether it's failing within your risk versus risk decision framework. Your adversary will be extremely interested in any of those impacts that are happening to their national interests. And specifically in the context of the United States as this kind of beneficent guarantor of world security, even if we want a little bit more out of it these days, it includes something happening to our allies. And I'll highlight India. Even if a Chinese program would risk some kind of impacts on the monsoon season in India, that is enough that, hey, the US wants to court India for great power competition. We want that ally in the Indo-Pacific. We're going to argue on behalf of India if they think that China is doing something that's detrimental to India. And then finally, there's this weaponization aspect. You can see in my paper, I argue that weaponization is a less plausible risk. It requires a very high amount of engineering that might not be possible with these complex climatic systems that we're talking about. But obviously, states are still scared of all sorts of implausible risks. So we should assume that when it comes to geoengineering, this will be kind of the same one. What are all of these? Well, Russia's an easy example. Would Russia accept 50 cargo-sized American planes flying over the Arctic every day for the next 50 to 100 years? No, they're very liable to say that is some kind of direct dual-use weapon. They're not just up there doing this environmental thing. They're up there doing satellites and intelligence and preparing weapon systems, etc. So that's another risk that we'll highlight. Now I'll go to this geopolitical influence risk to vital national interest. And you can see where I highlight for the first time green things. So the fundamental opportunity that SAI provides these two states is mitigated climate change impacts, which both are already on the record that they're worried about. I quote, existential threats, threat to the future survival of all mankind. If SAI or geoengineering works the way as advertised and we engineer it well, and the former risk versus risk equation overwhelmingly comes out in a net benefit, then the two states that. And they get it within their respective geopolitical perspectives. So China, in doing geoengineering, could argue, look, we've proven national rejuvenation. This is the new space race. China was able to do whatever program saved the third world from a problem that the industrialized world caused. And how can you and now, obviously, we're a co-equal player in world affairs because we're doing this thing. From the U.S. could argue the same thing. Look, climate change was something that China and India failed to address, and the U.S. is once again providing a global common good for the benefit of everyone just because we're that good. We're that good, and you guys owe us a little few concessions to make it happen. But there is still that risk where if your adversary does it, you are delegitimized because it is a huge thing. It is a huge niche thing. It's already been SAI in particular has already been banned at the state level in Tennessee, and I believe Missouri. So there is a lost credibility if the U.S. says I'm able to protect my vital national interests, and then its citizens look across the Pacific and say, well, how can you say that when China's flying these dozens of giant cargo airplanes every day doing something that we think is destroying the atmosphere? That other big benefit you can see is the billions or trillions worth in technological benefits. I won't discuss any more on these vital national interests. I'll just discuss how that then frames for future policymaking perspectives. So I want to highlight this dyadic analysis and the kind of columns of this thing. You can see on the x-axis there are broadly two categories of the US and China choosing their geoengineering policy. The first is to compete on geoengineering policy. The second is to cooperate on it. And then on the y-axis, I give two more categories on whether they're trying to deploy SAI or deter SAI. So these are four collective policy futures where, depending on how the US and China simply choose to do their policy. I want to highlight that these are not static. We should anticipate that the geopolitical situation will change and will shift between those, and I'll cover those more on the following slides. But I'll talk through each of these in a minute, or in sequence. So the first one I want to talk is the current status quo in the top left. It's that the United States and China are explicitly competing right now, and they're both implicitly deterring SAI. Neither one has released any kind of public policy statement specifically advocating for SAI. The US policy statements on it do have an implied deterrence position, especially against rogue actors, small scale actors, corporations, right? They are both in a position where they're generally deterring. And if one announced that it would it's pursuing geoengineering, the other would likely follow suit and say, no, we are against this for any number of reasons. And that seems to be playing out in international forums too, where geoengineering is discussed. The risks and the opportunities that I highlight on this page are from each state's perspective on the overall situation and why the risks of that policymaking scenario, but the opportunities within it. The current status quo, I'll start with the opportunity. The benefit of this policymaking scenario is that it aligns with the current status quo. The US and China don't have to do a lot of change to allow this political situation to continue to play out. It's that they can compete on all these economic front or the information or the military front, and they just don't have to worry about this very large disruptive technology. But there are risks in that. The risks are, look at this forum. The conversation is happening anyway. As that magical red line of global temperature increases, as climate change impacts become one, greater, and two, much more visible to the public and political decision makers, there will only be more discussion about geoengineering. I'm not saying that geoengineering is inevitable, but as the impacts of climate change stack up, we can definitely anticipate more discussion of this particular issue. And for a lot of countries, again, that asymmetry of impacts, there are countries who are going to suffer a lot more earlier, arguably who had less to contribute to climate change in the first place, who are going to help drive the conversation. Look, I am suffering more than the rest of the world, and we need to do this thing to save me, not just to save you guys. That conversation is already beginning, as shown by this forum. There's a inherent problem here, though, with continuing to deter each other. And you know what? I'm going to kick that can down the line to a different, that'll be discussed in scenario 3. One innate risk of keeping the status quo in place is that the US and China will have to deal with future chaotic SAI competition. So I want to take your perspective to like 2080, the year 2080. And broadly, the status quo is continued. The US and China have competed for other ways. History has continued, but they have both maintained a policy of no SAI, no large scale geoengineering. The problem is you're going to get more of those actors with more severe climate impacts than starting chaotic competition. And once the chaotic competition has begun, it is a lot more difficult to create a cohesive international or national level policy. So there is an incentive to create some kind of policy earlier. That brings me to scenario two. Scenario two is that the US and China cooperate to deter SAI. And my label for this is the decarbonization G2. Imagine that the US and China went through some kind of political detente, like we already did in the 70s and 80s. The US were already, and China were already partners for 20 years, as recently as the Carter and Reagan administrations, including military selling military equipment to China. Imagine 20, 30 years from now, some kind of major climate event drives both countries to say, look, we understand that climate change is getting really bad and we have to do something about this now, but it's not SAI. So we understand in order to mitigate this thing, we have to put our collective resources together to do traditional traditional decarbonization and non-geoengineering activities to cool the planet or stem the losses of climate change. That's Chinese industry matched with US technology and financing to do all of the neoliberal things that there's already a lot of literature advocating for. Green energy for the developing world, a much more equitable decarbonization process, you name it, all of those various things. The opportunities here are pretty self-evident. One, the US and China get to share some, if it works, they get to share some kind of peace dividend here. We cooperated, the dream of the 90s is back. We were able to create some kind of off-ramp from geopolitical competition, all while saving the world collectively from these impacts of climate change. From the Chinese perspective, they get to argue, the PRC gets to argue, look, we've done national rejuvenation. We're part of the international community. The Chinese model turned us from a feudal country into a co-equal great power, and we're doing it to the benefit of everybody. And the US gets to reap that same narrative dividend. Look, we integrated China into the political system. The US has been a benevolent, transitory power to a better international world system. There are still risks in that scenario. One of the big risks I'll include is that it is possible that the climate change impacts we are looking at, the SSP, is too high for traditional decarbonization to work. I know it's still academically contentious, but it is possible that there is too much global warming in the pipeline for the decarbonization G2 to reasonably mitigate all of these extreme impacts. So that brings me to scenario three. That's where one country, at least state A, just one between the US and China, is competing to deploy SAI. They decide for whatever reason that we need it. We need it, or they need it, or they're going to do it before the adversary does it. I want to highlight this as a more relatively likely and a more relatively dangerous scenario. This is the race to the stratosphere, a world where, we tried the decarbonization G2 for 20, maybe 30 years, and the window has passed. One of the countries says, look, I just had a 10 million climate migrant series of droughts or storms. I'm down $100 billion in mitigating these impacts. I've got humongous internal and external migrant sea. The time has come, or even already passed, for geoengineering. I got to do this thing. There are multiple problems with this scenario. It creates that competition. And in that competition, there's a race and there's the temptation to cut corners. The cut corners creates additional, they're like direct technical risk, but there's a massive risk in how you deter geoengineering. Traditional deterrence is about coercing your adversary out of a certain course of action. Here's the problem with deterring geoengineering. If the US or China is looking at large-scale geoengineering out of a sincerely held belief that it must protect its vital national interests against global warming, that is likely a completely untouchable deterrence threshold, where the other actor that wants to deter them has to make completely uncredible threats to try and deter that actor, especially when they're both on the record of benefiting from geoengineering and thinking climate change is an existential threat. Just a hypothetical situation. Imagine that 20, 30 years from now, the People's Republic of China says, look, we need to do it unilaterally with or without the US. We've tried the cooperative thing. It's not working. We have to do it now. What kind of credible threat can the US offer to deter that action? Don't do it or we will bomb you. The problem is the action is already going to be extremely popular in various other parts of the world. And the US is already on the record that we're going to benefit from a correction, that we are at risk of all these other climate change impacts. The Chinese argument becomes that's not credible. You're not going to start a giant world war over this thing that hundreds of millions of your people are going to knowingly benefit from. So it creates another risk. If your deterrence policy is going to fail, how do states act out instead? And then finally, that brings me to scenario 4. Both states cooperating to deploy SAI, or what I call the aerosol G2. This is a plausible future where after some period of competition or waffling about what the policy is going to be, they come together and say, we just got to do it, the two of us, not necessarily full global consensus, but we can make enough concessions to the important international actors that we're doing these things together. Obviously, that comes with a ton of risks. You take all of those generic risks of deploying SAI, you just make them large scale, and then there's all the governance factors. There's a legitimate question, still academically contentious, but how long of a policy is this? 50 years? 100 years? In some conceptions of geoengineering, 1,000 years? It is we should assume on those large timescales that geopolitical perspectives change. Administrations switch out, priorities change. So what are the risks of that large bilateral policy if one of the countries is going to pull out eventually? And you could argue that the US is kind of experiencing this same issue right now. A lot of countries bet on the benevolent United States continuing to be the guarantor of global commons for the foreseeable future. And then all of a sudden there's a change in national priorities that say, we want more benefits in exchange for what we're doing. How does that interact with a several decade long or even centuries long policy? There are opportunities in there. It could work. Like, frankly, what if this thing simply works? What if SRM or SAI works as advertised? We're able to achieve peak heating. We're able to spread out the cost of decarbonization, successfully transition the entire world into a more preferable temperature and avoid the kind of worst climate change impacts, right? I've seen a lot of those arguments in this forum as well, and they're worth considering. So I want to tab forward to slides to just highlight these plausible transitions. In fact, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I want to go to discussion. I'm going to skip these 2 slides about transitions, and I'm instead just going to discuss what I think are 2 novel things that I found in my research by adding this time component of wargaming out how policy changes over time. The first, and I see this largely in the cooperate to deter scenario, is what I'm labeling a mitigation abandonment window. So you've probably heard the moral hazard argument against geoengineering and SAI in particular that doesn't necessarily have a good causal chain highlighted. But it's a broad argument that, like, look, if we're kicking this can down the road, then there's no reason to do decarbonization, so the big emissions line will just continue to go up. Now, this is a completely different yet reinforcing logic for the same problem. So put yourself in the perspective of the United States or China, and you embrace the decarbonization G2. The implications of SAI or unmitigated climate change are so scary, you just say, you know what, I'm going to put all of the billions and trillions of dollars into stopping this thing, and the other country's helping me, so we can do that. We're fine. How long does that policy last? How many years or decades or administrations or 5-year plans are going to pass with you spending tens or even hundreds of billion dollars on decarbonization without any tangible, visible benefits to your geopolitical perspective? And if there is risk in that decades-long decarbonization policy that it ultimately fails, those countries, those states are going to find themselves in the same geoengineering dilemma that they had before, just hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of sunk costs later. So I think this mitigation abandonment window issue provides a similar problem to the moral hazard argument. It just has a different reinforcing argument, like logical argument and causal chain. The next thing I want to highlight outside of the abandonment window is this SAI decision security, like this dilemma and this SAI advantage security gap. So now that I've laid out this argument, and the US and China are broadly aware of the security implications of SAI, there is risk that those states are in a race already. Because just do the backwards math, right? If we anticipate that this will be a problem in the future, then we want to get ahead of it, and so will our adversary. If our adversary is trying to get ahead of it, then we need to preempt them getting ahead of it in various different ways. And in a sense, the geoengineering arms race has already begun simply because we're talking about it, right? There's already incentives for one state or the other to create advantages, whether it's in their legal system, their domestic political system, their technological, their industrial. There's a reason to make these advantages. So a question that comes up a lot in geoengineering security is, can you surprise somebody with this? I would argue yes. At the strategic level, surprise looks like a few years of advantage on shaping the overall policy scenario that you're going to land on. So it's plausible that the US or China could develop geoengineering technology secretly. I'm not talking very large scale deployments, but enough outdoor experimentation that is concealable, or you spoof the international satellites that would be detecting this thing. And the point is, when you begin that geoengineering discussion, whatever year it's going to happen, you have an asymmetric information advantage because you've already done this security, or correction, this experimentation, the scientific advantage in the near term. So yes, it is possible to achieve strategic surprise against your adversary with SAI. It just doesn't look like 100 birds going up over Alaska one day and dumping aerosols. It looks like a lot of um, concealed covert experimentation or information gathering or information operations, which I think brings me to my final prepared slide, which is these findings. These are my findings to various communities on what to get out of my research. First is that you should expand SAI research and conventional mitigation policies, regardless if future policy will land on deterrence or deployment. For research, it's look, if you want to deter this thing, that's fine. You need to understand the geopolitical implications and how best to deter this thing. And you want to understand whether the technology, like what its negative impacts are going to be, so you can highlight those in your information campaigns. At the same time, you want to expand conventional mitigation because whether or not you want to deploy or deter SAI, less carbon in the atmosphere is better for that policy. It's more credible to deter it if our shared pathways are lower. It's easier to deploy it if you have to do less relative quantity to overall heating. Next up is that SAI research can include geopolitical war games. My framework is offering just a different perspective. It's important to talk technical risks and opportunities. It's also extremely important to talk geopolitical things. Let's set up some war games. Let's set up some war games where a bunch of people meet in a room over a confirmed set of rules. They role play different states and coalitions of states, and we allow the players to create the hard, difficult solutions that those states might do in real life. It pays off for military planning. I anticipate it will pay off for geoengineering security planning. And then finally, my findings show that there is still SAI policy maneuver space. I understand that there are a lot of people in this group who are like very pro SAI advocates. The good news and bad news is there is still time for these states to decide their policies. Whether or not one of them changes it in the near term is yet to be determined. What I'd offer is that we are always just one black swan event from major policy changes. If tomorrow there was some kind of climate Chernobyl, some kind of massive, undeniable climate change impact that hits the US or China exceptionally hard, these policies could change much more quickly than we anticipate. So with that, I have presented like my prepared slides. I want to open it up to the floor for your questions and discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was very, I think, very succinctly and well summarized. You once mentioned, I remember, that as talking to military folks, you have to get to the point quickly. They have very little tolerance for reading long discussions, and they're always looking for the what's the beef here? What's your major point? So I think you you kind of exemplify that in your presentation. But anyway, okay, so we have, let me perhaps yeah, there we go. So I think in order of hands up, we will start with Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, I found that very, very good. Thank you. For several years, I've asked everybody I could find whether they know whether the DoD is investigating or modeling or developing scenarios for deployment independently of climate change preparation strategically. And I've been able to find no one who's willing to admit that they know of any work on modeling, on developing preparedness for deploying SAI at all. And so I'm wondering well, obviously, maybe you can't tell us, but first of all, what reaction do you get from military people? And secondly, if you can tell us, is there preparation for SAI deployment in the U.S. DoD or military?
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So I can say unequivocally, for all unclassified information coming out of the DoD and U.S. international security, the answer is no. No, there is no unclassified apparatus anywhere in the U.S. security structure that is specifically modeling scenarios, whether to do it or whether to deter it. And I say that with confidence because I am now advocating for that continued research. Like, my explicit thing that I'm trying to tell the military is this is coming down one way or the other. At some point, we will owe our national policymakers our recommendation on this thing. The proponent, one of the angles I've kind of framed it as is you could argue if SAI in particular was going to have a lot of negative impacts, you could argue that it's a strategic chemical weapon, right? And we have an executive agent that's in charge of deterring those types of weapons. It's U.S. Strategic Command. So my argument is just quite openly, we are going to own this. We should prepare for this, and we should do the research required to get to it. Could I reshare my slides? I have a backup slide for this.
Sure. Yeah.
Share, same, and I'm back in it. So this was my actual, what you saw is the Oxford paper is a much more like neutral perspective. The original master's thesis that I wrote was obviously, because I'm in the Army, a very pro-US perspective. And here's the diagram I gave at the end of it. Do nothing is a very high risk option because it's happening anyway, and you could simply be behind the geoengineering arms race when it happens, whether or not you want to deter or deploy this thing. Whether or not you want to deploy or deter or cooperate SAI in the future, that involves some changes now. Specifically, I recommended on this diagram that right now there's a amorphous group of institutions who look at geoengineering and geoengineering security, including an unclassified report by the National Intelligence Agency. My recommendation is that the Department of Defense should be the executive actor, the executive agent for this consideration, and we should include that into our overall policy of what's called integrated deterrence, because that is the U.S.'s status quo policy, and then we can help inform decision makers later if it comes to it. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me see. I think the second one was Robert Tulip, I think was second. Jeff, can you take down the slide? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. Brilliant presentation, really essential to place climate change in the security frame, which...
Robert, could you speak up a little bit? It's kind of hard to hear you, sorry.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jeffrey. It was a brilliant presentation. So important to place climate change in the security frame as a realist option. Now, there's a first, I suppose, question is I think that you've underestimated the benefits of SAI and of cooling the Earth more generally, rebrightening the planet. And I'd particularly note topics such as sea level rise, biodiversity protection, extreme weather, and also the risk of systemic disruption through tipping points. Now, these are the sorts of existential risks that need to be emphasised. But what I'm really interested in is the big problem that we've got in this debate is that there's intense opposition to decarbonisation in our societies. People see the risks of decarbonising as really expensive, and so this idea that SAI and other albedo technologies provide a way to justify a slower transition from our current global warming situation is really important. And what I've been advocating for is an albedo accord that is modelled on the Montreal Protocol. And what that means is that we see the clouds and snow and ice and aerosols as effectively an albedo layer, like the ozone layer. And we could see that the albedo layer is currently vaporizing or melting. And so it's a very similar risk that the world faced from ozone depleting substances, CFCs. And so the international cooperation as a single issue on ozone was quite successful. And so that leads to the view that perhaps governments will decide to focus on albedo restoration, rebrightening the planet, sunlight reflection as a single issue, and allow it to become a focus of international cooperation. Now, if the US and China could cooperate on establishing the governance for an albedo accord, they could bring other countries on board. So those are a few thoughts that I'd appreciate your reflections on.
Yeah, absolutely, Robert. Thank you for that. I'll lump your earlier comment into my response to that. And I am very aware of all of these other climate change impacts, and then how to brief decision makers and national security thinkers on the benefits of doing SAI, because you have to frame it in these hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, or however many millions of lives saved or millions of migrants foregone while mitigating those impacts. It's just, I know it's a shame that we need to talk about climate change in these terms, but it's the terms that are amenable to these decision makers in current policy, which is why I really reflect a lot on the Montreal Protocol. And I think it is not a good analogy for what we're looking at with geoengineering. Why? The Montreal Protocol was dealing with a pretty symmetric problem, which was the degradation of the ozone layer, then leading to increased cancer rates. It was primarily caused by the chlorofluorocarbons, things that we could get rid of very easily with very low benefits, or correction, very low cost to anybody and a very high benefit for all. Climate change is not at all the same way, nor is albedo, nor would geoengineering be. It's very asymmetric impacts. Some countries are going to suffer much more severely than other countries will. Some countries, and Russia is a good example here, perceive that they're going to benefit. Whether or not that's right is completely, up for debate. But while they perceive it that way, they will they'll drag down these kinds of actions. And then finally, I defer to my geopolitical narrative statement. I think the argument that you laid out fits squarely into that cooperate to deploy. That's scenario number 4. The question is, what actions can the community take, the overall geoengineering community, to convince decision makers to do this as an off-ramp from great power competition between the US and China? I would argue you could do information type operations. You could say it's a shared win. You could argue about the material benefits to discrete groups within those countries, namely the fossil fuel lobby. Hey, if you do large scale geoengineering, you'll want to do it cooperating with this other large country. You both get to preserve the fossil fuel economy and buy yourself time to do all of this decarbonization stuff. Now, that's a difficult pill to swallow. There's a lot of people in the geoengineering community who are SAI advocates, who are geoengineering advocates, who would not by any stretch of the imagination want to bill this as a get out of jail card for the fossil fuel industry. Those are the difficult, large-scale geopolitical compromises that decision makers would likely have to make to enable the aerosol G2. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Robert and Jeffrey, let me just ask that people try and get to the question as soon as possible, because we got a lot of hands up here, and we want to really hear what Jeffrey's thoughts are on all our various questions. Okay, and Robert, sorry, I don't mean to single you out. I think it was an excellent question. I just want to kind of speed things up here. Dennis.
Thank you, Ron. And I agree with Greg and Robert. Your work is a brilliant contribution, and I'm delighted with your clear analytical leadership on this topic. I'd like to propose that in the next phase of your work, that you might consider broadening your analysis in the following way. Many believe, including many of us in HPAC, that it will not be the US and China that initiate the move toward global governance mechanisms on SRM or SAI in particular, but rather there would be a move by the most climate vulnerable countries that push the issue towards a climate restoration plan based on the blending of SRM, emissions reduction and removals. So in fact, we are as an organization engaged in a high-level diplomacy initiative to have conversations with the heads of state of Brazil, India, Kenya, the Philippines, a number of groups. And our purpose is to stimulate them to consider being champions of moving this issue forward on the international stage. Now, this is not to exclude the US, China, or Europe by any means, but it is our view that with geopolitical conflict that you've described, it's most likely that the countries that feel the most pressure, like Brazil with tremendous floods and droughts, India with enormous excessive heat stress right now, the Philippines with these super typhoons that we're experiencing, and I live in the Philippines. So therefore, I'd like to broaden that idea, and perhaps you could build this into your analysis. Not that these countries would not only lead but do it, but they would initiate the global governance system that the US, China, and Europe would come in to support in a second wave of engagement. I'd like your views on that.
Yeah, I've definitely, and there's a great war game paper already published from some summer exercise in 2017, kind of proposing that. My general perspective on it is for that to succeed, those countries should anticipate tying the climate change issue directly to great power competition. And India is the easiest example. India saying, I got it. You want all of these military exercises. You want to know that I'm on your team in case it comes to a war with China. You really want XYZ, whatever. I am existentially tying the climate change issue to that issue. On the same note, however, is why I would caution why I think that might fail, that approach might fail. It's that those countries have similar geopolitical narratives that they're trying to live, in which climate change is not the number one issue. And I'll highlight India based on the conflict they recently had with Pakistan. When it came to the closing of the Dharma River, I forget the exact name of the river, but the one that closed and created the proximate military conflict between the two, the argument was not it was not India standing up and saying the US and the West have failed us and left us behind because of climate change. It was, we are going to punish Pakistan over terrorism in Kashmir. So if India in its obvious material interest, short-term interest, the BJP in power, Prime Minister Modi and what's important to him is not going to link those issues on any given day, is going to say, actually, the problem isn't climate change. The problem is the other people on my river using the same water that I want. Then the coalition approach, if you will fail. I would argue, I would offer a historical analog as well, and that was the non-alignment movement during the Cold War. And that failed. That was Thailand, India, various, I think Nigeria, various other African partners coming together and say, we don't want a piece of this pie. The US and Soviet Union were more than strong enough to repress that movement and force them into a position. I think there is severe risk that the US and China are just as powerful to suppress any kind of pan-equatorial coalition out of this.
Yep. Very good. Very good.
Yeah, thanks a ton, Dennis. Great perspective.
I would just add that following up with you on the war, let's say the games of looking at bringing in other countries into the mix would be something that would be very, very interesting to us since we are engaged in a lot of high-level diplomacy right now.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me just quick follow-ups are good, but not just one per person would be good. Sev, you're muted, Sev.
Hi, Jeff. I put 3 comments which I'd like your thoughts on in the chat. Could you go look at them and answer them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see the first one, winners or losers keep on changing their status. Yes. So I think that's like an important consideration on why I focus on just the US and China in particular, because a lot of those will say middle powers could be persuadable. And this is the current US and Chinese perspective. They're already competing over Thailand, over the Philippines, over Vietnam, to a lesser extent over Korea, definitely over Burma now, and Pakistan and India. Yes, both countries understand there are fence sitters, and so they are going to compete. When it comes to this very large-scale geoengineering, it means that those partners can extract a lot of concessions from whatever country is trying to get them on their side of the overall geoengineering debate, assuming that it does make it to that high tier of driving politics. The cooperation might be on some non-SAI interventions. It's true, I do focus primarily on SAI, but again, I defer to the White House. The White House Office of Science and Technology said, in no unequivocal terms, SAI is the leading candidate for near-term large-scale results. They specified near-term as I think before 2040. And the reason I'm focusing on that, in talking, I failed to address one of your questions earlier, Greg. How do military people react when I get into this? As much variety as the general public, and a lot of them roll their eyes and say, cool science project, next speaker. I literally had one high-ranking person call it a science project and told me to go away. I've had a lot of much more interesting reactions from other security thinkers. As soon as you say anything beyond the 14th five-year plan or 2049, I anticipate Chinese decision makers tune out. As soon as you say anything beyond the next midterm, in my opinion, a lot of US decision makers tune out. So for this thing to succeed, it's got to be tied to those near-term interests as well. And then finally, conventional mitigation is not the only alternative. You are correct. The science is still out. I think a lot of my findings are generalizable to geoengineering. Not all of them, obviously. So thank you for those comments.
Thank you. I think Robert, Chris.
I guess I'll repeat. Great presentation. It's really nice to have somebody talk to us who's got their feet on the ground in the real world. I want to ask you 2 questions, quite different questions. The first is that realism as a political doctrine is about relative power, relative benefit. So there is nothing in realism, as I understand it, that objects to harm being incurred by one of the players, provided more harm is suffered by the adversary. So my first question is, how do you see that the downside of that relative question being played out in relation to geoengineering, or SAI specifically? And my second question is actually about third-party countries. So at some point, whether it's in the development or in the eventual deployment of SAI, its impacts would, by definition, have to be cross-border. Wherever it was done, it would go across borders. So there is always the possibility that a third-party country that was not involved in the actual SAI deployment might turn around and say, hey, I've just suffered this terrible, terrible drought, flood, wildfires, whatever it may be, some environmental disaster, and it's been entirely caused by your SAI, and I want you to compensate me. Okay? How does that potential risk play out in your scheme of things? So they're the two questions.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one in harm, and why you're correct to point out that realism could have those perspectives. I also add a lot of constructivism to my argument on these lived geopolitical perspectives, and that states aren't unitary actors, right? They have different parties underneath the leadership that have their different competing demands as well. So there is a scenario, and it's why I outlined my research out to like the year 2100 and these 4 potential scenarios. Let's do a hypothetical exercise where I am a member of the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, and I'm giving kind of the same presentation after research. Here's an argument that I could give. Climate change is the West's weapon against China. The US perspective is that they are doing this. They know they're doing this. They've done it since the 1970s. They haven't changed their policy about it. They are hoping that climate change is the thing that destroys national rejuvenation. They're worried about 1.3 billion people. They're worried about our superior economic system. They're worried about our superior governance model, and they want to keep us down and the rest of the third world down to preserve their place at the top. Climate change is a weapon that the West is using against the third world. And therefore, in this hypothetical, scenario, China is obligated to defend itself against Western climate first strike. And we are justified in whatever large-scale geoengineering we need to do to protect our vital national interests and those of the third world that the West doesn't care about. Like that would be the argument. So on the other side, you could see where, hey, I got it. Climate change is going to be bad. For whom and when and how much? Because there is a perspective there. You could see either state becoming eco-fascist in a sense and saying, let it play out. I'm going to deter as much SAI as possible. I have a very diverse, huge country, and I'm going to be okay, and I'm very well developed, and this is going to hurt you a lot more than it's going to hurt me. So either offer up concessions. If you want to do geoengineering, offer me a ton of concessions, or I'm going to stop you. That is a perspective that we have to anticipate in the decades of this coming policy battle. And that brings me to your second part. I'll use a military phrase here. We have permissive and non-permissive operating environments. To your comment, what I would specifically recommend to geoengineering wargamers and security planners is plan for both permissive and non-permissive deployment environments. A permissive environment is the one that's assumed by a lot of the current geoengineering literature. Enough people come together to say, let's do the thing and let's go. What if it's non-permissive? What if there's countries threatening war, based on whether their neighbor is going to get a bunch of benefits from it? What if countries are turning to climate change and they decide that their problems have nothing to do with climate change? I don't have these problems because the glaciers have all melted and all of the species have died out. I have these problems because rich people are hoarding too much money, or people of this different ethnicity follow a different religion. That's what we experience today. We should anticipate that geoengineering will have to compete with those same interests. My bottom line to actually answer your question is there are important considerations that require additional wargaming and security research. Ergo, people should spend money to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Herb?
Sure. Thank you. That was a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. And if I had an hour, I'd keep you over a beer with a dozen or more questions, and I'm sure most of the rest of us would as well. Sort of two questions. One is, have you considered in any of your scenarios what has recently been termed derailment risk? It's a term I think that Laurie Layburn, who spoke at one of our meetings recently, coined, and some other folks. The risk that as civilization and societies begin to collapse, quote unquote, and supply chains, et cetera, get upended, that it may be increasingly difficult, even if a decision is made to deploy, let's say, SAI, to build the, the aircraft and the airports and all, and the logistics and the communications. So that's sort of the first question, whether and how you may have included that, or if not, whether you might want to consider that in any future scenario. And also, I was really fascinated by, I think it was your last slide, where essentially, if I remember correctly, you were essentially saying that even opponents of SAI should want more research to bolster their opposition. And as I'm sure you know, and we all know here, there's no shortage of opponents. There's the non-use agreement folks who really, they don't say they're against research, but they really are. And they've got something like 2,000 signatories of individuals and organizations, and almost no one on the other side besides us who is actually in favor of safe and effective cooling. So I'm just wondering if you have been asked or would consider giving your presentation to opponents and seeing their reaction to the scenarios that you're giving us today.
I'll answer the second one first. I'm absolutely open to giving this any venue at all whatsoever. At this point, it's just me and research I've done in the past, presenting it whenever in my spare time. So I'd be super open. And yes, it is interesting, but my argument with them would be like what I briefed in the slide. Why are you against the research? Well, because you're worried that the research is the first step to deployment. Why are you worried about deployment? Because you think it's going to be unequitable, like a new stage of, we'll say, environmental imperialism. You think it's just going to fail anyway. Okay, well, let's follow this through. If it's going to fail after deployment, it's going to have all these extra catastrophic risks, and the juice was never worth the squeeze anyway, then the research should show that, right? Like if you do large-scale outdoor experimentations, if you do additional modeling, if you allow more of the research to happen, and it's going to be extremely more damaging than it is beneficial, then the research should show that, and you should support it. You know, what would completely kill this conversation is tomorrow somebody published an absolutely undeniable waterproof paper that says geoengineering will fail. SAI will fail. It will not work because at this mass, the chemical reaction breaks down, et cetera, et cetera. You could anticipate some kind of tangible geophysical reason it's a pipe dream, it's never going to work. So why would you be opposed to if you think the research is going to bear that out, why would you be opposed to the research? It's in your favor. The second part is the slippery slope argument. And my recommendation there is your slippery slope argument will be, as geopolitics and history shows, will be eaten alive by state material interests. How many states would have needed to sign a non-use treaty prior to World War II in order to successfully deter the United States from using an atomic bomb? None. Any number, and it wouldn't have mattered. The United States, I specialize in the atomic weapon history as well. We were going to drop it. The decision to make the bomb was the same as the decision to deploy the bomb, whether it was going to be in Germany or Japan. We were going to do it. So now, if we're talking about climate change as an exceptional, completely unprecedented historic human event that is an existential risk to all mankind, if you believe that, why would a state stop itself from doing that just because of a treaty that got signed? And if you truly, what I find interesting is a lot of the anti-research advocates are also climate alarmists. And I don't mean that with a negative connotation. I mean that on like a spectrum of climate awareness, climate alarmism. Oh my God, we have to solve this now. If your argument is that climate change is about to destroy the planet and drive us into extinction, how can you possibly reconcile that with, but not geoengineering? One of those two things has to be, can't stand. Thank you for your point. And I think the derailment was your other one. The derailment, yeah. I did not write about that in my Oxford paper. I wrote about it in my master's thesis. My assessment was that it is so low, large-scale SAI is such a low technological barrier and a low industrial requirement that the US and China could unilaterally do this thing if they so chose, almost regardless of international supply chains. I think one of the most interesting things we've learned since 2019 is that right now, international supply chains are far more robust than we anticipated. We were able to survive COVID with a lot less impacts to international supply chains than anticipated and recover quickly. We were able to go through the closing of the Red Sea for 2 years for only a fractional increase in shipping costs going around the Horn of Africa. My point there is, okay, I understand derailment if blah, 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 blah. I think a lot of those ifs are less plausible, so I don't worry about it. And my unclassified assessment was, you're not going to be able to disrupt China out of this. If China wakes up tomorrow and says we need to do geoengineering, there is no amount of reasonable sanctions or embargoes or cyber warfare that will stop them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so last in our first set of questions, it would be last but not least, I should say, is Mike McCracken, and then I'm going to use my speaker's privilege to ask a question, and then we have Robert after me. So go ahead, Mike.
I have a question, but I first want to comment on this last matter that you were discussing. My sense in listening to the people who are climate scientists, and I'm one, who are opposed, is basically a view that it will pursuing geoengineering will basically deflect attention from really doing mitigation, which they argue is still possible. They haven't been willing to accept that, to an extent that governments can't actually do, full adequate mitigation, and that international negotiations generally are only capable of dealing with one thing at a time. And the idea you're going to do mitigation and intervention of some kind is plus adding CDR and the force and everything else just isn't plausible for negotiators to deal with. So that's sort of a comment. What I wanted to ask you about was your comment about black swan events. It seems to me the potential black swan events for China is maybe a failure of the monsoon, which is what they're really concerned about. I mean, I've done research with China, so and India, it's probably heat waves and a very high heat index, and not having a country that has the resources to have enough air-conditioned space to save its people. And for others, it's a global food crisis. Most of the major crops in international trade imported by 100 or more countries that depend on it come from a few spots. Grains grown in a few spots, maybe 5 countries. And we've had experiences where you get modest failures in one and the prices around the world jump. And then what it seems climate change brings is a likelihood that a couple of places are going to fail at the same time, and we just don't have adequate reserves. And so my question is, what does the military think is going to happen when there are huge numbers of people being affected and environmental refugees that are going to be rushing for higher latitude, mid-latitudes and safer places to survive? I mean, it's going to be 50 or 100 times worse than the refugee problem we have now, and very rapid. And countries can maybe defend themselves, against military force, but how do you defend yourself against just massive numbers of people who might environmental refugees who might be headed there?
Yeah, really great comment. So my response is really that I argue a lot of the same things you did, just military people and my military and geopolitical decision maker audience for this, which is, look, you big U, want to assess geoengineering as not important and not urgent. And then we have the conversation, and then they'll concede, okay, well, I can see that it is important, but it's not urgent. It's important for 2050. It's important for 2070. And then my follow-up is, no. Those events could happen, and they're going to clearly affect the military. It's going to be our partners getting destabilized. It's going to be climate migrancy, as you pointed out, orders of magnitude larger than we currently deal with. And we will suddenly need to provide a recommendation on this. Do we deploy or do we deter? That's it. So my secondary feedback is trying to convince national security writers and thinkers geoengineering is both an important problem And it is an absolutely urgent problem because you are one black swan away from this becoming a defining issue of international geopolitics. The military doesn't want to hear that right now. Secretary Hegseth has been pretty explicit. He calls climate change woke or a distractor from lethality. But at the end of the day, the DoD serves according to whatever the Congress and the executive order us to do. And there is a ton of potential for them to suddenly want an opinion on this topic. It is our responsibility as the Department of Defense, in my opinion, to be prepared to inform decision makers. Whether or not we think we care about climate change, we should anticipate that our political authority will be interested. Thanks a ton, Mike.
So if I can just follow up for a second. So it really doesn't have to be related to climate change, which sort of scares them from using the words. I mean, you could have climate variability where, I mean, India's been having episodes right now or something in some of these other places that are going to lead to large numbers of deaths. And the military, at least the Navy, has been the way in which countries, can move resources right to the edge where you can maybe help supply when an earthquake hits or something and reestablish that. And does the military have scenarios for dealing with extreme kinds of events? I mean, there was that tidal wave in the Indian Ocean that killed a couple 100,000. Does the military have scenarios for trying to deal with sort of really extreme, weather-related disasters?
I'll offer yes, and I don't want to deviate too much from this venue, but yes, what you're referring to is called contingency planning, defense support to civil authorities contingency planning, and it happens at the combatant command level. So the U.S., the DoD, the U.S. has organized the whole globe into these different geographic combatant commands run by a 4-star general who's responsible for their area of responsibility. That's where the contingency planning happens for this. I would note that a recent change ordered by the secretary and certified by the national authority is we are combining North Command, which is North America, and South Command, which is South America. We're combining them into one single command, and we're combining those U.S. Army commands with U.S. Forces Command. The bluff of all this is we are creating a single button, a single 4-star general that the executive branch can push when it needs those kind of domestic activities done, either in the United States or just in this hemisphere. We are creating structural change that allows the military to be that kind of Swiss Army knife to non-combat operations, at least in the Western Hemisphere.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. That amazing talk. I'm really I think this is really important stuff because as others have commented, we're just not used to thinking in those kind of very realist, real world kind of way. So let me just follow up. I have so one, your story, your little story about India and Pakistan really kind of led me to thinking that this is kind of what we're essentially facing here. We're blaming, immigrants. We're blaming China. We're blaming, people. We're like little rats in a cage fighting with each other. In the meantime, nobody's looking up. It strikes me that one of the biggest threat that India and the entire South Asia region is facing is the melting of the glaciers and no more water. And that's a really near-term threat. I've been looking at some things. We actually have someone who's trying to do something on that. Leslie Field, but to really address it, you need a much bigger kind of climate intervention like SAI. So two questions. One is we, as you may know, we are distinguished really among climate groups by our emphasis on we need to urgently cool. We need to urgently deploy cooling, not just research. Research is great. We're all for research, but if we're facing a near-term situation where we believe what we have already is too high. 1.2 degrees. We've had papers coming out and saying a lot of these glaciers are, that may be irreversible at this point. Centuries of meters of sea level rise. All the possible risk of, people have talked about AMOC, about all kinds of things that, are already, the risk for those things have already been increasing. I think it's fair to say that's pretty clear. The Arctic sea ice is, almost gone, for one thing. That one is reversible, but still, it's only reversible if you cool. So the thing is, I think, is there a recognition that, for example, to get SAI up and running, to be effective, you can't just flip a switch? So that may be, I know there are a lot of the policy people kind of talk about this, this kind of yes or no kind of dichotomous decision, but it's really not dichotomous. You need to build this. You need to develop it. It could take decades. Wake Smith, as I think he says that we need to start by 2035 to possibly have something by 2040 that just for polar SAI. So Robert, I think, could you mute? So anyway, so I think that is one thing that I think, I don't know if the military folks are aware that this is not just some hypothetical thing that you can pull out when you need it. We really need to not just, we need to do more. We need to actually have pilot programs working on this right now if we're actually going to have this ready when we might need it. The third thing, and I think you brought this up in one of our conversations, is this relates, and should be for U.S. strategy thinkers, to the kind of larger kind of, to be frank, you can call it our way of life, civilization framing for the future. If most of us in the U.S., I think, are strong believers in democracy. And so if you want a democratic system if you want the world to kind of continue to progress toward the kind of Enlightenment values in democracy, free speech, free association, all those kind of things, you need the world, you need the democratic, quote unquote, the U.S. is not so democratic at the moment, in my view, but that it's either that or, as you've said, the Chinese perspective may be, well, the trouble with democracy is their leaders are too short term. They just care about the next election. Apparently, from what you said, in the military, many of the leaders share. Robert,
you need to stop. Ask the question.
Okay, well, this is my question: is to what extent is the military leadership looking at those longer term, larger issues in this context? Because I think they're important. So I'll stop there.
This is where these large documents and elections will say do matter. Formerly, the DoD published strategies and risk assessments of climate change. The DoD has been ordered away from those and is prioritizing other missions right now. There are still security planners elsewhere in the U.S. government that work on this. The National Intelligence Agency is in charge of the entire portfolio looking out at long term. When it comes to the military continuing to discuss this topic, you're looking at them, which is the number one reason I'm still doing this. It's because an awareness that, like, I got it. You told me this doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you that eventually your boss, a political decision maker, is going to turn to you and say, give me an opinion. And then I will be here ready to help inform you because I anticipate this will be a big deal, which is why I keep communicating to as many people as possible. And one of the reasons I'm staying in the military is to try and be able to help inform this when the hard question eventually comes. The military, though, is also not, and so a lot of times I have this discussion and a question, to rephrase a question, I get asked something to the effect of, is the Army going to save us? The answer is no. Yeah, right? Like, because we are subservient, and I totally agree and love this, to the political authority. If the political authority tells us to go in a certain direction, we will do that. So my recommendation to you, and I want to highlight before I say this next thing, I am really truly SAI neutral. I am geoengineering neutral. I am neither an advocate for or against it. And it is essential that I stay that way while I'm definitely like the only dude talking about this in the DoD. If you want to deploy, I recommend expanding the information operations that you're doing to increase climate alarmism. So if I can share one of my slides real quick, I had a backup prepped. You see this little diagram, and this is a very simplified version of information narratives related to climate change. Very simplified. On the far left, you've got denialism. Denialism's changing to be less about climate change isn't happening to, oh, it's not going to be a big deal. And then you have doomism. Doomism's a perspective out there. There are perspectives out there that it's too late for geoengineering anyway. There is so much global warming in the pipeline, you could do full-scale SAI, it doesn't matter, we'll be extinct by the end of the century. Those exist. What I want to highlight is these two windows in the middle. The blue is a window of climate awareness that gives you a deterrence window of opportunity, but that's not what you're interested in, Ron. You're interested in the green one. The green one is climate alarmism. The more that important decision makers and the constituents that they care about are in this green window, the better postured you are for your policy success. It's more people saying climate change is important and urgent, and it's going to damage our vital national interests. It's going to damage me personally and my kids and the things that I care about, that we are justified doing this very large, unprecedented thing of this direct human control over climatic systems, or I should say influence over climatic systems. And I recommend using this kind of language in whatever decision, whoever you're talking to. Again, it's as you're turning to a large donor or a policymaker, this isn't gonna be urgent. This is already urgent because we are one black swan away from it destroying national systems and environmental systems, destroying the base of national economic support in the environment. And we're gonna need to be postured to do this very quickly. And I would even use the securitization version of it. We are one black swan event away from China deciding they want to do it, and deterring them is going to be very difficult. So we need to discuss it more now. Whether or not you want to deploy or deter, we need money and research now to prepare you to act when the black swan event changes the dialogue.
Thank you. So thank you very much. No, I think you know, a good speaker like yourself, I think, does that, you know, kind of turns the question around. Well, what, you know, you need to work on this, you know, what are you going to do about this problem? Which is, you know, I agree. That's it is in our court. Okay, so let Patrick, you haven't had a chance to speak, and then I think what we'll do is you know, after Patrick, Robert, do you have a quick question? Because I'd like to give Jeffrey just a chance for the final words before 6 o'clock. But go ahead, Patrick.
Jeff, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate your perspective on this. And I'm new to SAI and learning about SAI, so it's refreshing to hear the perspective that you bring to it. I find it curious that you say you're the only one at the DoD, the only dude at the DoD that's presenting this, and more curious to hear you say that you're not advocating, because it seems like you are advocating for more research and more preparedness, which I think is a wise thing to be advocating for, whether or not you are advocating for deployment. But I'm just curious about your strategy of getting more people on board with you and promoting awareness within the DoD and within your ranks or among your colleagues. So that's one question: is how is your strategy to not be the lone wolf, the only dude at the DoD doing this? And then the other question is about do you make any presentations to the private sector, any of the private contractors for the DoD? And do you think at any point this could be private sector driven by the bottom line more than a national security issue, but contractors of the DoD that see there's a lot of money to be made in this and are going to use their influence at the DoD to take it up the ladder and bring more importance to the topic.
Yeah, thanks a ton, Patrick. I really appreciate that. On advocate, I'm definitely like, you're right. I'm advocating for more research, but I'm definitely trying to stay neutral on the deterrent or deployment. I'm not somebody who says SAI at any costs. I'm not somebody who says this should never happen. I'm somebody who's trying to inform everybody on both sides of the issue and how to better prepare their respective arguments. Now, what I really try and highlight, and this is talking about the communication strategy, is high payoff actions where, regardless of course of action, it's just a good idea to do, which is like highlighting the research. I've done this with whatever senior military leaders I could speak to about it. And I get on their calendar, present it when I can. I get on environmental groups that are within the DoD and present it when I can. But it's whether or not you think this is super scary, end of the world technology, it's basically chemtrails, whether you think, oh my God, the miracle solution we've all been waiting for, more research is a really good idea, especially wargaming, the geopolitical outcomes and the geopolitical transitions of these policy changes. I mean, that's one thing I want to highlight, and we skipped over those slides. It's important, but there are transitions between these different policy scenarios that can be anticipated and managed a lot better than in other circumstances. So no, I do not speak. I have not spoken to like the private sector. In a different life, I would take my research, I would take my ball and go home. And I would leave the DoD and I would go present it to whatever corporation I think stands to make a lot of money off of this. And you're right, I would not be surprised if tomorrow ExxonMobil and Tesla released a joint statement saying that they are starting the world's premier geoengineering research facility. There's a world where I'm a defense planner in China, and I reference what I said earlier, where I say China is exceptionally vulnerable to this. We must be the ones to develop it before the West does, right? But to me, it is essential that I preserve my credibility as a neutral party on it. So I don't do that. I'm not saying that I would turn it down, but I definitely wouldn't accept any money for it. You're right. The private sector is important. And one day I anticipate getting a phone call from whatever three-letter agency saying, look, we'll give you a whatever amount of money to start talking about this thing to policymakers with us. I've already been offered a job at one other institution. But my point is, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't have a framework to be pro or anti geoengineering. We need to have a very large, open, candid conversation about it because so many big things are at play. Thanks. I hope that answered your question. I know I trailed a little bit off at the end there.
No, that's great. You're a great communicator, by the way. I think you're very organized in the way you present, and I think you're an asset to advocating for whatever you decide to advocate for. But I hope you do receive calls in the near future to call in.
Okay, well, I would second that.
I'll ask a
Absolutely.
final question, and that is, Jeffrey, do you see potential interest within the Trump administration, for example, from Energy Secretary Wright in your analysis?
Yes. So I like to keep this politically neutral. So I give my hypotheticals in future nondescript terms. Here's how I could anticipate people have a certain image of a U.S. political administration that like wants to do this, and it would be a certain party that like climate change is a big deal. We have to worry about this. We're granola people, and we're going to do this. Here's how a different administration could do it. China is destroying the world. Chinese pollution is destroying the environments of the third world countries, and all of those migrants are coming here to the United States. They are destabilizing our vital national interests elsewhere in the world. The United States, as the guarantor and provider of global security, because no one else can be trusted to do it, is going to step in once again to save the world from China's irresponsibility. Now, 10, 20 years after that policy change, you can anticipate, gimme, I'm doing the thing. I'm saving the world. So what am I going to get in return? Some kind of concessions later, right? You could easily see a world where the United States says, I need to preserve the fossil fuel industry. I need to preserve my current energy system in the United States. And I want to leverage SAI as a prestige victory. I want to be able to turn to all of these countries along the equator and say, look what I'm doing for you. And now it's your turn to provide me what I want against China. It could happen.
Well, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Just outstanding, great talk. And, I hope we have many future discussions along these lines, because I think it is a really, you're raising a really, really many critical issues here. I think I speak for everyone. So we've already gone over. I didn't realize that because my computer clock is 12 minutes slower than my watch clock, and I'm never sure which one is correct. But that's a sort of maybe reflects the kind of person I am. Never mind. Sorry. Never. But anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jeffrey. And we'll see you in, I think our next speaker will be Dave Spratt, actually. The next session in June, that would be Dave Spratt is supposed to be on June 26th. So keep that on your calendar. Dave Spratt is a bona fide doomer. I mean, in a good way, highlighting all the very serious consequences that are going to happen if we continue on the current path. And so I think it kind of does really fit as a follow-up to this. So thank you, everyone, and see you in a few more weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
2 more weeks.
For anyone staying on the net, I do want to take that last word that Ron mentioned earlier. So things that I ask the group: one, please consider the language that I used in this, and feel free to adapt it and use it later. Whenever we're talking about climate change and geoengineering policy, it's a good idea to ask yourself, am I speaking the target audience's language? And if your target audience is very large-scale decision makers, it's vital national interests. Don't talk to me about penguins. Talk to me about billions of dollars. And preferably talk to me about trillions of dollars, right? Next is I ask that you feel free to reference my work and send it to other people. Feel free to send me any work that you think is relevant that I benefit from, because I want to keep going on this. And yeah, I appreciate it. And then finally, just please keep me in your ear, in the back of your head, as at least one dude in the military realm who's on this. So I really, truly anticipate a point at some point in the future where we need to play catch up, and I want to be there to help us play catch up. So thanks a ton. I really appreciate everybody's time. This was the exact type of incisive commentary and questions I knew you guys would give anyway. So thank you.
Thank you.